Bom dia, buenos dias, good morning, bonum mane in Latin. It's a pleasure. We are open this new date about the new course of the School of Advanced Studies in Water and Society Under Change. I am very proud to introduce a new lecture from Professor Patricia Gauber from Arizona State University about social learning for climate adaptation and a robust decision making. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here and the opportunity for me to really go in depth about what my ideas are. So the first day, I think I gave you an overview about the kind of work that I do, the importance of decision-making and certainty to scenario development and thinking about the future, and this proactive work is very important. And then what I tried to do in my second lecture was to really bring home the qualities of decision-making under uncertainty, to talk about the limitations associated with optimization and prediction, and the opportunities that offer us to provide useful information for adaptation and climate decision-making. Now this is my third day, and what I believe is that there are two dimensions really to sociohydrology. We all aspire to be sociohydrologists. And what we've talked about to date are how do we integrate human behavior and human variables and human decision-making into your hydrologic models, all right? So you're hydrologists, you want to do sociohydrology. What aspects of policy, price sensitivity, what are human behaviors that we know about, what social memory, how do we integrate these in a theoretically appropriate way into the models that we're building? I think that's all well and good, but I think there's another aspect to sociohydrology. And we are the obvious place to begin integrating the input from decision makers into our model creation itself. This is a time to organize the public, the decision makers that we work with, to enlighten us about what they want to know about what kind of socio-hydrology models they would like to see, and then work with us for how do we begin to produce those models. Because I think if we, and I've alluded to this yesterday, or the day before, if we don't do the work that they're interested in, they're not going to use it. If they're not invested in this model building effort, it's for scientific consumption and not for changing the world that is at risk from climate change. So we've got so we have a whole process of human interaction and human behavior, and most importantly, social learning swirling around. Or in a perfect world, we'd have all this social interaction surrounding our socio-ecologic or socio-hydrologic models to ensure that they have a chance for enlightening the public. And I've thought some about this, and I think you saw some of my pictures the last time we really took this, this mission seriously to create what-if scenarios of the future based on policy changes. These weren't, we didn't want to just develop what-if scenarios that arose in my head that I thought might be interesting, but rather what the people in the community were willing to talk about. I think I mentioned the first day, there was really 15 years ago you couldn't talk about climate change in Phoenix. Climate change or the need for climate adaptation. Those were just the president today. The president of the United States regards climate change as a hoax. So he and his cadre have historically made it difficult for us to have a real serious talk about the infusing climate change into our models. So this is about being sensitive to what people are talking about, what people are interested in, and finding strategic ways to integrate those ideas into our model. And I think if we rise to the challenge of sociohydrology, we're going to rise to that challenge as well. So I just want to show you some, or tell you a little bit about our past experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So sometimes you learn from your mistakes. So we have some learning from our mistakes. But I think as social scientists, I'm a social scientist, and I want to participate in sociohydrology, and I want to think about your models and suggest ways that your models can represent human behavior and make that connection between the natural system, the physical system, and the human system. But I also know that there's a social system surrounding the development of those models itself. And it's that I like to write about and think about, and information that I would share more generally to the audience. So what do I have that's important to say? It's really what's uniquely important is what I can say about the social processes surrounding this model development. And I already showed you this picture, the climate modelers in the Western United States talking to our stakeholders about how they parameterize their models and what kind of information that conveys to the stakeholders about the uncertainties associated with our models, and provides them with some useful evidence about how to move forward. I think probably it also helped to direct us away from the climate models in our discussions with the population that we wanted to bring on board. I did the same thing. So in 2010, I moved to Canada, and I tried to do the same thing. It was also the hydrologists were in their camp, very much interested in sociohydrology. How do we find plugins? How do we plug in market? How do we plug in policy? How do we plug in known social behaviors? But we knew, I was going to say very little, nothing. We knew next to nothing about how stakeholders saw the problem of water security in Canada. And so I took it on as my one of my missions. One of the missions is to sit with the hydrologists and think about how we can alter these models, tweak the models in ways that represent human behavior in a credible, meaningful way. And then the second, to reach out to audiences and try to get an idea of what they're interested in talking about at a certain point in time. So it's a lot of similarities between the United States and Canada, and I think a lot of similarities between water managers in the United States and Canada and the UK. And I would hypothesize that there are lots of similarities between the United States, Canada, the UK, and Brazil. It's a profession that has a point of view that we can learn from. So, how do we kind of get interested in this? Why did this become one of our agenda items from day one, from 2003, when we got the money to begin to support our project? There was a pretty strong discussion beginning in the United States Congress. And that conversation said, we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on climate research, and we aren't making progress in adapting to climate change. And this may occur for, maybe people reject this science. An alternative point of view that I think many of us shared was that we weren't doing this science in a way that was useful and meaningful to the potential consumers of our science. So we've sat off in our laboratories and we've interacted with our students, and we're in groupthink about what the problem is and how we solve the problem. And we are not making significant progress in changing the public discourse or the public policy about our changing climate. And that's a pretty, pretty difficult diagnosis to be made. But this was coming, this is after 25 years of climatology research. And the United States government, the National Science Foundation, was stepping back and saying, so what? What's next? Where do we go? We haven't gotten really what we want. We haven't gotten really what we wanted. There was also the call for, you know, we do what interests us because that's why we're scientists. So we have this capacity to look inside ourselves, and we have passion and excitement about the problems that face us. But those may not be the problems that society needs to be solved. So I think from the decision makers in Washington, we got the note that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on your science, and we're not moving ahead. And this is public money, and this is public money that cannot be for your curiosity-driven research alone. We've had a lot of leeway in pursuing the questions that we think are important, that address our curiosity-driven questions. We're being paid by the government of the United States of America, and we expect you to give us some insights on how we might move forward on this change. This was the conversation in the science community in Washington. This is the conversation among the science policy, as the science policy people were articulating it, and it's trickling down to the hinterlands, or to the Phoenixes and to the other regional centers. There were people, again, from the science policy community looking at research projects, and what is there about the research projects that separate them from the societal questions that are so important to be solved? This was a time when how many know we started talking about Pasteur's quadrant? anybody know who Louis Pasteur was? Pasteurizing milk. We got it. He did what? Besides, he pasteurized milk, but also, he solved a pressing social issue of the time. But what else? Anybody? Louis Pasteur was a basic scientist. He was the father of microbiology. So he did basic science, but he solved the problem as part of that science. So we could see somebody who could work in both the applied realm and doing basic research. As we looked around in the early 2000s, we didn't see any of these folks in the. These people weren't very prominent in the climate in the climate science or the climate adaptation group. So we were looking for we were looking for how do we change the traditional model into something that Louis Pasteur would be more comfortable, would embrace the kind of work the kind of science that he did. And what we found was what the science policy guys called the loading dock model. What we saw when we were looking at the sociology of climate science, what we had were climatologists working in their own groups, in their own communities, quite separate from the people who would use those products. It's called the loading dock model because they're going to show up in their trucks and they're going to dump off the latest IPCC reports, and people are going to just carry those reports back to their workstations and try to figure out how those downscaled climate models, what they meant for them and their community, and for our interest for the water resource. Well, there was a tremendous kind of criticism in Washington about this loading dock model. The science was organized around the priorities of the science. They were interested in climate dynamics, ecosystems, water cycle science, the carbon cycle. This is the focus of the public's money that we were using for climate research was addressed to these questions, and with very little thought about who'd use it, who cares, how is this supporting better decision making. And I think there was a realization that scientists and decision makers have different views of what is useful to them. So what we do is produce something that we think is going to be usable to the person who operates the reservoirs. But have we spoken to them? Do we know how they've behaved in the past in response? We should be doing better, and socio-hydrology should be a place where we can do better. Science and decision makers have different views of what's useful, and they also come from different reward structures. So, I'm a professor. I came through the ranks. I got credit for refereed research articles and scientific citations, which I was looking at this morning. You can't help it. But they have a different social structure about what they believe to be important. And what do we really know about that? Very little, but we do know that it doesn't involve scientific research articles and citations. That they're working for a different, what's going to get me points in my job? It has different dimensions to them. So this article, I think, was very powerful. In a 2011 article in Global Environmental Change by a couple of social scientists about using credible science, opportunities and constraints for climate knowledge use and their implication for science policy. And these guys did a really deep dig into, they used short or medium-term climate forecasts and how they studied how they were produced by climate scientists and how those products were used or not used in the weather forecasting community. El Nino sort of stuff, the capacity to think about the El Nino and the effect that El Nino is going to have on temperature and precipitation in a particular region. And they wrote an article where they kind of differentiate what the usable. I mean, they studied maybe 40 or 50 projects with an aim toward how they were using these forecasts as part of their work. They were really interested in the interactivity between the scientists and the users of science. And what they found is that when the scientists and the users had functionally interacted, it was more likely that the information that came from the scientists to the decision makers would actually be used. Probably not a surprising discovery, but what was significant is one-off efforts almost never work. They don't build. Here's what I'm doing. I'm going to deliver to you the results of what I've done. Is that knowledge from the scientists about these intermediate forecasts going to be translated into forecasts? The one-offs almost never were. But when relationships emerged between the scientists and the forecasters, over time, back and forth, the iteration of that information was really critical to a more productive translation of science into policies. The other thing they said that moved me was that somebody needs to own the problem of connecting science with decision makers. It doesn't just happen because we want it to, or even because they want it to. It has to be an explicit job of some person, some organization, to make that continuous interaction occur. And this is something that we know we have to invest in modeling, but we also have to invest in these relationships and these long-term relationships. And what is it going to cost when the National Science Foundation passes out money now? We pass out money not only for science, but we pass it out for public engagement, and public engagement that's now we know has to be, it can't be come to my cocktail party and see the results of my latest book. It has to be down in the trenches. What are your needs as forecasters for the hydrological information that we have the potential to provide? And so that's a different thing when we say that our science agencies need to fund relationship building. Hey? Because without those long-term social relationships, this science is never going to see the light of day in the decision-making community and have a positive impact on our societies moving forward. Someone needs to own the process. It could be somebody in the agency who's especially interested in the latest science. I think I could put names on those kinds of people from my years of working with water managers in Phoenix. Some of them were just more geeky, and they did their science, or they did their water management, but they were also really interested in these science questions, and they were naturals for us to make our connections. Same for Canada, and they're also in the science community. There were some people who you have to leave them in their labs because they don't communicate to a wider audience particularly well. But there are a few who can engage. And those are the folks that these boundary organizations that provide the glue to keep these boundary organizations together. This is what my group did, the Decision Center for Desert City. It was our job to mediate the boundary between science and policy. So I think in addition to doing the modeling, the water sim, the visualizing the water sim, it was our job every day to get up in the morning and think about how we were maintaining this communication between the scientific community, the water managers that we worked with, as well as the local leaders who would ultimately be making decisions. It's not a half-assed, it's not a casual process. It's a serious process. It's a social process that social scientists need to engage in, but in a thoughtful way, informed by what we already know of 20 years of largely unsuccessul experiences. Hopefully we've learned from those. So I showed you this picture the other day, scientists and water managers in a room hashing out which of the 21 climate models, we can only choose 3, which ones are going to choose, which one are we going to choose, what are the pros and cons of the two, the groups arguing among themselves, observed by the other side, transmitted a considerable amount of insight into the process. So I already talked about this the other day. We're in the business of robust decision making, and a real critical part of this robust decision making is science-based, but it's also linked to. I mean, we want to build scenarios, and we want to look to find futures that are going to be okay. you know, we're looking to sustain. I tell you about a mega drought that occurred in the 1300s. We actually have the water and we have the storage capacity. Do we have the brains and do we have the political will to be able to manage our way through a very difficult situation that our forefathers and foremothers could not do? And so we're looking for future solutions that will work well under a wide variety of climate conditions. So we've got our water sim model. I think I told you when we first developed this, it was all climate. We had people choosing which climate scenario they wanted to pick and how sustainable their community was to different decisions that they made. Over time, we began to stress, as I mentioned, this is water sim. We came to stress the policy options they had And that was very much because people said to me, Pat, we don't want to talk, we're not interested in this. We're interested in the policies that we have available to us at the community level, and we'd like to be able to manipulate those to see what our future conditions would be. So we really altered the model as it went through, as we heard what people wanted to talk about what can we do. Those are obvious. I think I already told you this. Obvious adaptation decisions. We discovered scientists and decision makers had different conceptualizations of uncertainty. Scientists look at statistical uncertainty, and decision makers don't care about such things. They really worry about the other uncertainties in the decision making that they face. And it's really good for us to know those constraints that they have in seeking to provide relevant information to them. I've already talked to you about the uncertainties that we face, and I don't, making the point that climate is just one of them, and probably of least interest to them. So here's our Canada group. I think Howard may have shown you this picture. We're getting a lot of action on this picture. These are our stakeholders. These are our stakeholders in Canada. And I think having come from my ASU American experience, and it took us too long to engage stakeholders directly. I mean, we had monthly water climate briefings, and we engaged them when we wrote the original proposal, but then we kind of worked on our science projects for a year or two and didn't involve them, and that's how we made our mistake with the early versions of WaterSim. So I was very, very concerned when I moved to Canada to get these people to the table right away, and let's take down their names, and let's bring them in and make them part of our we have a common goal, make them part of our project. So we brought them in and had them initially play some games. Games, gaming is a way to figure out what's important, and we also I was interested. We took a survey in the first year just to figure out what they thought was important. How do they prioritize the concerns that they had? So a low number means that is an issue that we presented them with 8 major concerns, and then we asked them to prioritize them from 1 to 8. So a low number means that people are really worried about it, and a high number means that those are slow in their priority scheme. They were very interested in water quality issues. Canada had 2 catastrophic water failure of small town water plants where people had died, and this had been popularized and publicized largely across the country. So water quality was of great concern to them. Interesting what water governance was. I would say, and I I think I mentioned to you the other day, is that I believe that the lack of sharing governance relationships it holds us back in climate adaptation. We'd be much better trading with each other, sharing with each other, making agreements for how we would handle certain situations under certain conditions. Decide that 25 years before we need to do that. The Canadians thought water governance was a problem for them as well, and so the failure to coordinate this critical resource. All right, they've got a lot, they can make a lot of mistakes, but it was weak water governance that they considered to be the second challenge. Water quantity, they were just coming out of a major drought period where farmers had to cut back their water consumption. Land use management, visionary in my mind, that they could see, thank you, that they could see the obvious connections between how we manage our land influences how our water is used. And they could see that. What I want to say that I thought, my takeaway was that the stuff that the scientists were doing, so I'm this social scientist embedded in a group of 150 to 200 hydrologists, climatologists, ecologists. What I thought was really interesting was the stuff that they were mainly interested in: drought, long-term climate change, what do the climate models mean for northern Canada, flooding. Those were at the bottom of the concerns that people told us that they had. And I thought it was important for scientists to see this information, because when they frame their presentations, why should they be important to you? Why is this information important to you? What might you potentially do with this information? They're going to somehow have to make a connection to the things that people on the ground are seeing as important on that day. So this was just a little way to figure out, well, you know, I've changed country. And you may think Canada is just like the United States, and it's not. It's its own country with its own culture. And so we just want to get a feel for what people cared about and maybe work on problems that people cared about. We were interested in this Churchill River Basin, huge swatch of territory in North America. Canada's got a lot of land and a lot of water, and it can make mistakes. So do you. So it can make mistakes more easily than a small country in a more densely populated country. But this was the study area for the group. What we've done more recently is to try to figure out what I think our hydrologists are interested in integrating policy variables into their research. So we've done a systematic review of the documentation that exists across watershed documents, across government documents across that region, to try to figure out what are the conversations on the table now. So, you know, we don't want to gin up policy levers that they're not interested in. So we tried to figure out in a systematic way what's on the agenda. What are we beginning to talk about? So we studied and did a qualitative review of hundreds of policy documents across this region to just get a sense and to categorize them into particular groups. So we found particular interest, or a classification scheme we came up with was, there was a lot of talk about gray infrastructure, hard dams, reservoirs, concrete, drains, gray infrastructure as a way to deal with a changing climate. You can build infrastructure. You can build green infrastructure too. You can reorganize the drainage patterns across natural systems, and you can create spaces where infiltration can take place, so you don't need such big, some big concrete barriers. you are all interested, you guys have been interested in economic instruments, and Canadians are interested in water markets and what water markets might mean for the management of water resources moving forward. They're also interested in policy instruments. What happens if we mandate mandate fixtures and appliances in new homes? What happens if we mandate different uses, maximum amount of uses for water? What if we have rules around the way people build their houses? We considered that as economic policy. Regulatory policy, strategies to achieve objectives based in laws, regulations, standards, codes, and guidelines. So we saw that in the documentation and coded it accordingly. Information policy, strategies to influence behavior based on the transfer of complete and correct knowledge, communication, water conservation education campaigns, that kind of thing, as a policy instrument, as opposed to regular policy that involves, creates rules, processes, procedures, strategies for administrative changes, potentially changing governance systems. Think about the way we organize water differently than the way we do now. So, with this kind of a framework, you look at hundreds of documents and code them for these ideas to see what's on the table and what's involved in the conversation. This is a pie diagram talking about gray infrastructure, green infrastructure, regulatory policies, economic policies, pricing policies here. This is organizational regulations, and this is communications. Did I get that right? Yeah. Okay. So regulatory policy. Regulatory policy. So then we looked at how often, how much they're used, and you know, all six of those kind of types of policies we see as part of the policy discourse on the ground in water planning in Canada. A sizable chunk for economic policies, and a fairly large one, a chunk associated with organizational policies, as opposed to organizational regulations, as opposed to like education campaigns, information, providing, instead of providing, we're providing information that inspires people to use less water, or use it in ways that would be deemed more sustainable. The green infrastructure square wasn't, or a piece of the pie wasn't all that big when we started collecting data, and then in 2005, we went back and looked at documents from 2005. But the conversation was beginning to change in Western Canada from hard infrastructure and very little interest in green infrastructure to increasing interest in green infrastructure over time. So I think we got to see that this might be more interesting issue to begin to integrate in our model, and then a growing number of people were interested in this policy choice as a way to manage water. We also kind of looked at those categories, those 6 categories, broken down by different characteristics of the. We looked at papers and documents from different groups, and we organized them into industry groups, watershed groups, agricultural groups, environmental groups, and provincial. The province of Saskatchewan, the province of Alberta, and they do their own water planning. So we looked at the difference between. These are economic policies, the yellow one, and the red ones are interest in regulatory policies. So what do we want to talk about? Who wants to talk about the market, and who wants to talk about government regulations as a way to manage climate change moving forward? Well, not surprisingly, industry groups want to talk about the market. Watershed groups, many of them occupied by farmers, want to talk about markets. Agricultural groups, the farmers want to talk about markets. Environmental groups want to talk about regulation. I mean, what do you do at the provincial capital to assure a fair and productive distribution of water resources, especially under water stress? I mean, everybody's going to be fine in the average year, but it's in the stress years. How are we going to deal with that? Environmental groups are looking to government to solve that with regulations, and obviously people who work for provincial agencies see regulation as a source. I say that, and I say this because, and I think maybe we always understood this, but we really understood this after we began to look at these data. If we want to draw people together to give us their point of view, if we want to get a global point of view, we absolutely have to have representatives from all these different groups, because we know that they care about different things. But to have some expectation of what their interests are helps us figure out who to invite to key events, who to ask for feedback, and I think we know a little bit more about that now than we did before. Here we look at the green infrastructure and the gray infrastructure. The gray is obviously gray. Industry is interested in building dams and irrigation canals to be able to address water problem. So are watershed groups to a certain extent. Farmers want the canals extended because that allows them to exploit more, bring more land under cultivation. Environmentalists are interested in green infrastructure, that whole conversation. And the province is interested in gray infrastructure. So I just offer this to you as a way we invested early into a deeper understanding. It's just a way to connect to people, figure out what they care about, get a sense of who we want. When we do the next meeting, then we're either going to have meetings of these groups separately, and I think we know what we're going to get, And I think we can try some but we'd have to have 5 different meetings. But we can also draw them together with representatives across the group. So this is social science in action, not as a variable in those models, but in a way to understand human behavior, human preferences, and maybe use those to guide our model processes. So this is how we went about doing that work. I'm going backwards. So I think the big takeaway message today is that the decision-making uncertain. If you buy into the decision-making under uncertainty, research protocols for dealing with adaptation, then associated with it is a social infrastructure for linking scientists with decision makers. And I don't know if you can have the sociohydrology. I don't think you can have legitimate sociohydrology without this stuff, without making some investments in figuring out what people, building relationships and what people are interested in learning about. And with that, I will come to an end.
Muchas gracias. Muito obrigado, Patricia. It was very, very insightful lecture. I would like to warm up this discussion, starting with your last slide about the lessons learned. And I'm making an announcement for tomorrow, because tomorrow we have not one day immersion engaging stakeholders, but we are going to have half day, only in the morning. And tomorrow we are discussing with people coming from the ground, from the municipality, the local scale, also people working in the master plan of water sanitation and water infrastructure, green and gray water tomorrow in the morning, and but trying to do through a neutral space for education. It's not going to make one people against others. This is a neutral moment, but taking scenario development for the next decades. So we termed for the day of tomorrow São Carlos Water Security 2120. That means 100 years in front, ahead. So my question is also looking for these Lemos papers that you presented, and also in the Nelson Churchill basin, the example you presented. First of all, dealing with transboundary situations, because it's very clear, like in Nelson Churchill, like we in Brazil and also in South America, we are in all time we have transboundary problems. So the governance should be shared and agreed between the upstream parties and downstream parties. And it's very hard to have a survey from people for the entire catchments sometimes. So the question is, what will happen if we put different parts of the agriculture, from the industry, from the environmental, you thought that, you show up these different feelings and perceptions about green and gray, and the weight they have. So this guy, this second. So my question is, what will happen from a transboundary conditions of a catchment, medium-sized catchment, from your perspective, dealing with decision-making? Because we are dealing with transboundary conditions, we are dealing with scenarios development, And we are dealing with different people, First Nation peoples. That is a very important point. In the case of Nelson Churchill, we have the hydropower planning infrastructure for the next decades. And also in Brazil, we are planning some great infrastructure to have water security for coming decades. So how can we use a neutral space like education and UNESCO chair and so on, but trying to put these people in the terms of governance, uncertainty, decision-maker under uncertainty, and transboundary conditions. But this because this is our daily situation in Brazil and South America. So governance, decision-making under uncertainty at the long term, but under transboundary conditions. So it is, I think it's a warming up question for all of you. Thank you.
I think there's and I don't know, Howard can correct me, or you can come in on this. I think there's a good deal of goodwill in managing some of the transboundary basins in Western Canada and the Great Lakes. But the Great Lakes belong to Canada as well as the United States, and these people have a multi-decade relationships with each other that lead to problem resolution. I think we actually have one of the men who works for us in Canada sits on the Canadian International Joint Commission, Al Petronero, and he has led us carefully through those knotty situations. I don't think we haven't done much modeling on those in those situations because they're so political. They're so political, and we have a man on the ground who keeps us abreast of what's going on there. I don't know if I have an insight as to how to break into those worlds, but very, very cautiously, respecting the fact that these guys and gals have been working together for many tens of years and have a deep understanding. Howard, I don't know, what would your views on this be?
I think there's a lot to be said about transboundary waters. And I think the first point that you made is a really good one, that actually all around the world, people come together in very constructive processes to try and overcome these challenges. And I think the Canada-US International Joint Commission is a really good example of how that's worked well. Although it's fair to say that under the recent US administration, there is a sense that there is more tension in some of those relationships. As far as the basin that we work on in Canada that's got 3 provinces, then they have an agreement that was made in the 60s for water sharing, which is a strength and a weakness. Because, as I mentioned on Monday, it's like tablets of stone. So it guides and frames policy, but it's very difficult to move beyond that because people are afraid to break this framework. So it's difficult to be creative and introduce new issues of management. And another point about that is that it's been very difficult to get significant action on water quality issues, as I also mentioned, because there's so much vested interest around agriculture, and agriculture are a major source of nutrients, and it's really difficult to get management. Another sort of related example is the Red River, which drains from the US north into Canada, and that is responsible for eutrophication of Lake Winnipeg. And it involves thousands of stakeholders and farmers and communities in the US and multiple states in the US. And in Canada, it's the same story, and there are multiple provinces. And there's been a long evolving attempt to bring these stakeholders together and to come up with some kind of common vision. And that's evolving, but evolving really slowly, and there's not actually been much action on the ground. So these organizations are taking a lot of time because of the political difficulties around some of these differences. I can talk a little bit more about international disputes, perhaps, because I've been involved in a few. I was involved in a dispute between India and Pakistan a few years ago, and what was important there was that in the 1960s, the World Bank sat down with India and with Pakistan and produced an agreement for the Indus Waters management, and that was very comprehensive, and that has been a really powerful tool. So even though you've got two countries which are both very confrontational, then they have managed this transboundary water on the whole very successfully because that agreement is in place, and it's very prescriptive. It doesn't allow India to develop too much storage to threaten Pakistan and so on, but it does allow joint development to take place. And that's been working very well up to now, but that's a little bit under threat because Modi, the Indian Premier, is being quite confrontational over Pakistan's water. I'm involved right at the moment in a dispute between Chile and Bolivia over transboundary water, which is entirely political. When these water disputes come to the boil in terms of confrontation, it's often because there's a political agenda. So in this case, the president of Bolivia accused Chile of stealing Bolivia's water, which in fact is complete nonsense because the river under dispute has flowed from what is now Bolivia to what is now Chile for many thousands of years. But nevertheless, it was part of his political platform. And as a result of that, there's been great expense from both sides and a lot of good science. And the case is due to be heard in the International Court of Justice in The Hague next year, but it should never have happened, actually. The International Court has heard 3 water disputes. I've been involved in all of them. Hungary against Slovakia to do with dams on the Danube, Argentina versus Uruguay to do with the pulp mill on the River Uruguay, and then currently the Chile-Bolivia dispute. And the court, interestingly, sees its role, of course, as applying the principles of international law, but it also tries very hard to mediate and come to an agreement which would be satisfactory to both sides. So it's a very interesting story, and I'm not sure what I conclude. I think a few other things to say about the Canada situation is when Pat and her colleagues did the surveys, there's some very interesting political differences across the basin, which happened to coincide with the provincial boundaries. So in Alberta, which is the oil capital of Canada, people were very kind of towards the right wing about the environment is there to provide us with resources which we should be using. And Saskatchewan, which is the home of the health service in Canada and more socialist inclined, takes the view that really we should have a stronger focus on environmental protection. And then, of course, downstream, we've got First Nations, and their perspectives are wholly governed by valuing the natural environment and its cultural heritage. There are power games around those, and on the whole, of course, the First Nations don't have a lot of political voice, and the oil producers do. Yeah.
For a very world journey that we are brainstorming for the next. And also taking your example from North America, this is Nelson Churchill. Nelson Churchill is not the same, but this is Canadian, and we have the San Francisco here in Brazil, also a transboundary river basin, also from some latitudes to the north, passing different latitudes and perceptions from the people in the headwaters and people or states in the downstream areas. And also in South America, we have some, as you have Colorado, or the Columbia River. You have part in the United States, part in Canada, and also coming to the United States. We have the Paraná River, for instance, here, or the Amazon River. So my question was that the governance, the decision-making under uncertainty, and this approach about transboundary conditions, and also the flags and the perceptions you present in Pat, it's depending hugely on when, of course, the scenarios, and where and who are taking the decision. So if we can weigh these parts, it's at the final result, we have a political agreement of having more towards environmental groups or green infrastructure or more to gray infrastructure. But if we make the same survey in the 20 next years, perhaps these ways are changing. You know, that's very interesting about time, scale, and people. So there are hydrological scales at the most. So I try to say that hydrology is very, very close to social decision making.
Can I add to that I was very wary about intervening in politically fraught situations and losing stakeholders as a result of it. But having said that, I think there's a tremendous amount of value in gaming these agreements by putting new climate information, the new climate model information in them, as well as putting policy information in them, and spinning those agreements out under what if future climates. And I've seen that done more recently in the Colorado River. It's kind of like, you've got Arizona, and in the southern basin states, you've got California, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. And we can game out and when those rules have been gamed out, they've used the different pieces of the historical past. As I showed you last time, they tried them out with medieval conditions, and they tried them out with other drought conditions. And really, people were scared into action for a new drought management plan by the fact that those plans that have held these states into an agreement for 75 years, you can see very clearly that they're not going to pertain in the future. I think there's a tremendous amount of benefit that can be done by that kind of work that we could do quite easily, and then let the chips bring people together and let the chips fall. But I think it's changed the conversation on the Colorado River.
Hi, I'm Barbara. and I'm from USP, also, but from São Paulo. And my question is, I have two questions, actually. The first one is about this graphic. The people were aware of the different solutions. Have you, when you did all the talks, all the interview, you guys showed them all different solutions from the different stakeholders?
These were not interviews. I probably didn't describe this in correct terms. These were an examination of documents and we're looking at 200 documents across Western Canada to see if we saw a particular policy discussed about it in that particular document produced by a watershed group or produced by industry. So they weren't interviews.
And do you believe those, because the documents are our indicative, right?
Mm-hmm.
But do you believe it would be different, the percentage, if people were aware of different kind of solutions? If, for example, agriculture groups were more familiar with green infrastructure and their potentials, and maybe they would do more projects on that. If we work on do you believe it would have a change in this percentage?
I do.
Because I work in a
yes.
I work in a project, and we were talking with people, and also I was gonna ask if it's because it's about documents, right? But you don't have the data from communities, people from communities, right?
Mm.
Because we in the project I work, I even talk to. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, working in a project about the implementation of green infrastructure in two communities. Mm. One has already been implemented, and the other one hasn't. And what people perceive the river and how they came up with different solutions for it. And most people come in with solutions of green infrastructure because they never heard of green infrastructure. And we noticed when we talked about it, there were a different response. At first, in the previous interviews, almost everybody was choosing the green infrastructure as solutions for their problems. And after showing the green infrastructures, there was a change. Not so much, not a really significant one, but it was really interesting because it showed people were not familiar with different solutions. And my second question is, how do you have told us on Tuesday how much you think the governance is a really important factor, governance, and how do you model that? Do you use policy? Do you model that, translating that into different policies chosen?
I think you can model sharing in Phoenix. You could model different sharing agreements into the system, and in fact, we have played with that, where we say my community has an agreement with that gets water from the Salt River, has an agreement with the one north of it that gets water from the Colorado River. How do we? What if we decide to share beforehand? We've made this agreement to share beforehand, and then we run through what the potential drought conditions would look like. But under that, when Scottsdale lose water, Tempe will give the water to Scottsdale. I mean, I think you can model that and experiment with what would happen. And we've got before you do, we sit over these alluvial groundwater resources, so you can begin to think there's a pot of water beneath us that can be pumped. You could change the rules that exist now and pump it, and you could begin to show people the longer-term resilience associated with sharing. Sorry.
I was just going to say that I think governance in general is at a rather interesting stage, because certainly in Canada, traditional water governance is at a provincial level, and that in itself has problems because rivers run across provinces. But within the province, it's very top-down. And there is a lot of frustration, I think, at the grassroots level, because people on the whole feel that their voice is not properly heard. So I think that was one of the things that was coming out of Pat's survey. Why people were interested in governance was because they felt disenfranchised. One of the things that's happening there is that there is some support for watershed groups. And so they are given a little bit of money from the province to help them organize and bring together stakeholders around local river basins. And there's a huge amount of voluntary work done by those groups, and that's been very influential in, for example, implementing beneficial management practices and so on. But still, those groups would say that they have very little resource and very little power, and they feel rather frustrated by that. So I think there's this kind of, it's at a moment in political history where in I think many places there's a strong desire for the grassroots to have a stronger voice in the governance around water. On the other hand, of course, we know that water has to be managed within its concept of a river basin. And so there's this tension between needing to take a holistic view at a fairly large scale while recognizing the needs and concerns of people at the local scale. And that's a really interesting tension that's around at the moment, I think.
Let me, and I would say that I'll personalize this. I took my role as the queen of the boundary organization very seriously. You know, I'm the mediator. I have to be a person who's trusted on both sides of the boundary. And so these international agreements and these internal grievances, I could lose all my credibility with my water managers by making public positions and disseminating information that they didn't want. So it was a constant, ongoing struggle of trying to play both roles, but to be seen as a legitimate character by both sides of the boundary. So I had lots of strong opinions, and I just kept quiet.
Yeah. So I'll just comment on that legitimacy issue. I mean, I was running the institute in Canada, and that was again very challenging because we wanted to be neutral and continue to be seen to be neutral. But for example, the agricultural lobby in the province is hugely powerful. And so it was really difficult to talk around the issues of nutrient pollution. You couldn't really talk about nutrient pollution, but what you could do was to talk about making agriculture more efficient by using less fertilizers. So there's a whole very careful balancing line. And we had a very interesting issue with First Nations down in the Delta, because I had a number of colleagues, Pat and I had a number of colleagues who've invested a huge amount of time to help inform those communities and give them a voice. But they received some money for some of their research from the power utility that controlled a dam just upstream. And so in the view of the First Nations, they were selling out to the enemy, and that destroyed for a while these close relationships that have been built up over years, all to do with a perception. And in fact, the researchers were doing their best in the interests of the community, but the community turned on them because they perceived that. So these situations are very delicate and quite political.
There's a time for more questions? Yeah. Pat, would you mind coming back for the slide with the stakeholder priorities, please?
Which one?
The stakeholder priorities, please.
Is that when?
Yeah. Yes, this one. I have a question because the way I see it about major concerns that is most of times they are very interconnected. So, for example, water quality and water quantity, most of times we're talking about them together. And for example, if you want to talk about water quality, most of times you're talking about land use management as well. So what were they thinking when they were talking about water quality or land use management? Because most of the times, if you want to achieve one, you need to achieve others as well. So like if you want to talk about water quantity, and you can be also concerned about drought. So this is just one thing that I would like to know how they perceive these concerns, like what are their real priorities when they are talking about this.
Well, I think what they had in their heads when they said water quality were these water company failures, and where people had lost their lives, and so they were responding to the inadequate sanitation system, and these are rural farming populations, so they manage their own personal water with septic tanks over a very large expanse. So I think that water quality answer was a reaction, a short-term reaction to an event that had been in the newspaper on a very regular basis. I think we knew, and what did they think about with water governance? I think they lacked faith in the capacity of institutions, the status quo institutions in Canada, to respond to their needs. I think they saw there had been a recent drought, and a number of farmers had lost part of their businesses, and it was a very highly publicized event. So when I think they talk about the lack of governance, they're talking about there were not mechanisms in place to be able to manage this stuff when it happened, and they knew that and they could feel that, and I think that's what they were reacting with this. When you get into the water quantity and when you get into the land use management, they're worried about drought with the water quality. I don't think they were worried about flooding because they had that choice later on. I think they realized the significance of land. When you make land use decisions, you make water decisions. I think they knew that relationship was in place. So I think that was I took that as an understanding in their heads of the complexity of the system. So competing demands. It was interesting that that was ranked relatively low relative to the others, and then the hazards. You know, that I guess I just saw those hazards sitting there at the bottom, and higher priority with the capacity to deal with the hazards as a broad statement that they were worried about.
I think this comes back to the comment you made earlier that people don't feel they can do anything about droughts and floods, but what they're interested in is how can you respond to those and manage those. So.
We published this in it's been 2004, 2005 article in the Professional Geographer, just to talk about the Professional Geographer is a place where we reach out to practitioners. So this was an attempt to say we're trying to listen to you now. Tell us what you think is important. I guess it's just some broad messages. I think we just, now as I look at this, we just wanted to get in the game. We wanted people to know that we cared about them and that we were interested in what they had to say. At this point, I knew nothing about the intricacies of Canadian water policy that were in some ways the same and in some ways very different. And so it was just, tell us how you feel. React to these words. And I think there was some insight gained. Certainly, these were insights derived from it.
Well,
You cutting me off?
Not because it's okay.
It's all right. It's all right. I know I have somewhere to.
Luciana is not here.
Oh,
he
okay.
has some delay.
Oh, but it's Howard.
But this is a very good conversation. So my question is, did you point? Your answer, your question, was answered about? Yes. Okay. So try to make a round about the discussion. That was very interesting. I can pick up about legitimacy that you mentioned, Howard, and I put an example here. Through the last drought crisis we have, it was not a drought crisis, it was a rainfall anomaly in the rainy season that during 2 years that the metropolitan area of São Paulo, people lack some part of the water they used to have in previous time because the water withdrawal was very, very high. Yesterday, Felipe told us about his story in this event. But it was very interesting because during the drought or during the rainfall anomaly, all people in São Paulo have learned about what is a river basin. Because in previous time they say, okay, the water is coming from a Cantarera system. What is Cantarera? It's a big tube. It's a big pipeline. It's water surging from a pipeline. They have never learned before that the water is coming from a watershed. And it was a very learning process because through the crisis, people learn more about how the hydrological cycle is, and also the governance around that. So that's an example of a river basin here in São Carlos. Yeah? You know that. Thank you.
Can I make a social science comments on that?
Yes, of course.
And I'm going to be a little preachy. I think we should stop talking about drought crises and we ought to talk about governance failures. Why aren't we better prepared for these events? Why haven't our societies organized themselves to deal with these issues ahead of time? We're really educated and we're really smart. We should be able to figure this stuff out. And I think if we frame them as governance failures, rather than as climate events, we're we're going to get some different insight into them. That's the latest social science word.
Okay, this is water crisis, governance failures. And here in this round, we discuss about who, when, was interesting because about the scenarios approach, and where, because the transboundary conditions, and what, there's also people explaining about that. And you term it the neutral space. And when you, sorry, is your name? Barbara, when you asked about if the people have previously received training or not, you have different results about the perception. So that means that is important, this is the education process. An education process that's trying to make also about legitimacy, that's how our legitimacy, sorry. So, yes? Yes. An education, so the point is how. And also, I think that's the how process. How can we get this point together or integrate them? This is the education process that we are trying to do as a neutral space for a learning process. And that's, I try to catch up this very exciting discussion and brainstorming about that. Because at this discussion, we catch all the things, the scales, time, spatial, transboundary conditions also, transboundary conditions. So, and I think that is one of the goals we are seeking for in this school. So I'm very excited. Thank you for your brainstorming, and I motivate you to maintain this high-level discussion. And thank you, Patricia, to chair this moment. Thank you. Can I just say something? Of course, of course.
So
The
I'm
last
on
word.
next. I'm on next, and I'm going to have a change of topic. So in the publicity, you probably saw me down to talk about arid regions. I'm going to talk about land use management and beneficial management practices and stakeholder engagement instead. So come back after the coffee break.
Thank you.